Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we journey into one of the most powerful and haunting tales from Greek mythology, the story of a warrior so mighty that his name alone could turn the tide of battle, yet so vulnerable that a single arrow would bring him low. Before we begin, if you happen to like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It really helps me a lot. That's all. Now back to the video. The story of Achilles, the greatest hero of the Trojan War. A man born of both mortal and divine blood, destined for glory, yet marked for an early grave. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Before we meet the man himself, we must understand something essential about Greek heroes. They were not like us. They did not live quiet lives, did not die in their beds surrounded by children and grandchildren. The heroes of ancient Greece burned bright and fast, like comets streaking across a midnight sky. They chose glory over safety, immortal fame over a long life lived in obscurity, and no one embodied this choice more completely than Achilles. His story begins not with him, but with his mother. For to understand Achilles, we must first understand the circumstances that brought him into the world, the divine machinations and prophecies that shaped his fate before he ever drew breath. There was a sea nymph named Thetis, one of the 50 Nereids, daughters of the ancient sea god, Nereus. She was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, graceful as the rolling waves, with skin that seemed to shimmer like moonlight on water. Her beauty caught the attention of the most powerful beings in existence. Both Zeus, king of the gods, and his brother Poseidon, lord of the seas, desired her. They competed for her affection, each certain that such a radiant goddess should be his bride. But the universe has a way of protecting itself from its own rulers. A prophecy emerged, spoken by either the Titaness Themis, goddess of divine law, or by Prometheus the Titan, he who had given fire to mankind and could see threads of fate that others could not. The prophecy was simple and terrifying in its implications. Any son born to Thetis would grow to be greater than his father, greater in strength, greater in power, destined to surpass whoever sired him. When Zeus heard this prophecy, his ardor cooled immediately. He remembered all too well how he himself had overthrown his father, the Titan Cronus, who had in turn overthrown his own father, Uranus. The cycle of sons overthrowing fathers was not something Zeus wished to continue, especially not if it meant his own fall from power. The thought of a son mightier than himself, wielding power greater than the thunderbolt, was unacceptable. Poseidon too withdrew his suit. Neither god would risk fathering a child who might one day challenge their dominion over earth and sky and sea. So the gods decided that Thetis must marry a mortal. If her husband was mortal, then her son, however great he might become, would also be mortal. He would die. He would never ascend to Olympus, never challenge the divine order. The gods would be safe. They chose Peleus, king of Phthia in northern Greece, for this honor. Or perhaps it was a curse dressed up as an honor. Peleus was a hero in his own right, one of the famed Argonauts who had sailed with Jason in quest of the Golden Fleece. He was noble, pious, and brave. Most importantly, he was entirely mortal, incapable of fathering an immortal child. But Thetis did not go willingly to this marriage. She was a sea nymph, daughter of Nereus, with divine blood flowing through her veins. The thought of lying with a mortal man, of binding herself to someone who would age and wither and die while she remained eternally young, filled her with revulsion and sorrow. In one version of the story, she had rejected the advances of Zeus himself out of loyalty to Hera, which may explain why Zeus was content to marry her off to a mortal. Now she was being forced into a marriage she never wanted. When Peleus came for her, Thetis used every power she possessed to escape him. She transformed herself again and again, becoming fire, water, a lion, a serpent, each form more fearsome than the last. But Peleus had been counseled by Chiron the centaur, wisest of his kind, who had told the king that he must hold on no matter what form the goddess took. So Peleus gripped her through every transformation, refusing to release her until finally, exhausted, Thetis surrendered to her fate. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis became one of the most famous celebrations in all of Greek mythology. The gods themselves descended from Olympus to attend, a rare honor for any mortal. The muses sang, Apollo played his lyre, the Graces served the feast. It should have been a day of pure joy, but even then, darkness lurked at the edges of the celebration. There was one goddess who had not been invited. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, had been deliberately excluded from the guest list. Perhaps the other gods feared what chaos she might bring to such a gathering. But Eris came anyway, uninvited and angry. She brought with her a golden apple inscribed with 3 simple words that would change the course of history: for the fairest. She rolled this apple into the midst of the celebration, where it caught the eye of 3 powerful goddesses: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each believed herself to be the fairest. Each claimed the apple as her own. The dispute that arose from this single act would eventually lead to the judgment of Paris, and from that judgment would come the abduction of Helen, and from that abduction would come the Trojan War itself, the war in which Achilles would win his eternal glory and meet his fated death. But that was still to come. For now, despite the ominous presence of Eris and her apple of discord, the wedding continued. Peleus received magnificent gifts. The centaur Chiron gave him a great ashen spear, so perfectly balanced that only the mightiest warriors could wield it. Poseidon, perhaps feeling some lingering affection for the goddess who might have been his, gave Peleus 2 immortal horses, Balius and Xanthus, swift as the wind and wise enough to speak. From this union, from this marriage of mortal man and immortal goddess, came a child. They named him Achilles. The moment Achilles was born, Thetis knew she had given life to someone extraordinary. Even as an infant, there was something about him that spoke of greatness. But she also knew, with the terrible certainty that came from her divine nature, that her son was doomed. She had heard whispers of prophecy, caught fragments of a fate that could not be changed. Her son would be the greatest warrior the world had ever known, but his life would be short. Terribly, tragically short. This knowledge tormented her. Here she was, a goddess, immortal and powerful, yet completely unable to save her own child from death. She could not bear it. She would not accept it. If the fates decreed that Achilles must be mortal, then she would find a way to make him immortal, to cheat death itself. The ancient sources give us different versions of what Thetis did next, each more desperate than the last. In one telling, she anointed the infant Achilles with ambrosia, the food of the gods, hoping that this divine substance might burn away his mortality bit by bit. Each night, she would hold him over a sacred fire, allowing the flames to consume the mortal parts of his body, while the ambrosia preserved the divine essence within him. It was a slow process, requiring patience and perfect timing. But one night, Peleus awoke and came upon this scene. He saw his wife holding their infant son in the flames, and naturally, he was horrified. He didn't understand what Thetis was doing. He saw only his beloved child being burned alive. He rushed forward and snatched the baby from the fire, screaming accusations at his wife. Thetis, furious that her work had been interrupted, that Peleus had stopped her before the transformation was complete, abandoned both husband and son in a rage. She returned to the sea, to her father's halls beneath the waves, leaving Achilles still mortal, still vulnerable, still fated to die. In another version of the story, some sources suggest Thetis had borne other children before Achilles and had tested each one by plunging them into boiling water or holding them in fire. None had survived. They had all been too mortal, unable to withstand the test. But Achilles, her last child, was different. When Peleus interrupted her, the boy had already passed through most of the ritual. He would live, but he would not be fully immortal. But the most famous version, the one that has echoed through the centuries and given us a phrase we still use today, appears in later sources and involves the River Styx. This was no ordinary river. It was one of the 5 rivers that flowed through the Underworld, the realm of the dead. The Styx was the river of hatred, the boundary between the world of the living and the domain of Hades. It was a river of such power that the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths upon its dark waters. Thetis took her newborn son to the banks of the Styx. The river's power was immense. Anything that touched its waters would be made invulnerable, protected from all mortal harm. So Thetis gripped her baby by his heel and dipped him into the black current. The waters covered his tiny body, soaking into his skin, his flesh, his very bones. Everywhere the water touched, he became invincible. No blade would pierce him, no weapon would harm him. He would walk through battle unscathed. But there was one place the water did not reach. The heel where Thetis held him remained dry, untouched by the Styx's protective power. That single spot, that one small area of vulnerability, would one day be his doom. It's worth noting that the oldest sources, including Homer himself in the Iliad, never mention Achilles having this general invulnerability. In Homer's epic, Achilles is actually wounded in battle. The Paeonian hero Asteropaeus manages to graze Achilles' arm with a spear, drawing blood. In Homer's telling, Achilles is formidable because of his extraordinary skill and strength, not because of magical protection. The story of the Styx and the vulnerable heel appears to have been developed later, perhaps by the Roman poet Statius in the 1st century, as a way to explain how such a great warrior could fall to what seemed like a minor wound. The later tradition sought to make sense of his death by giving him near invulnerability with one fatal flaw. But whether he was truly invulnerable except for one spot or simply supremely skilled, one thing was certain. Thetis had done everything in her power to protect her son, and it had not been enough. The prophecy hung over Achilles like a shadow. He would have a choice, his mother told him when he was old enough to understand. He could live a long life, quiet and peaceful, dying old in his bed surrounded by descendants who would quickly forget him. Or he could go to war, achieve glory that would never fade, and die young. Those were his options: long life without fame, or a short life crowned with eternal glory. What would you choose? What would any of us choose? In the soft comfort of our modern lives, it's easy to say we'd pick long life and obscurity. But Achilles was not like us. He was born in an age when glory was everything, when a man's deeds were the only thing that could outlive his body, when immortality came not from the gods, but from the songs sung about you after you were gone. Still, that choice lay in the future. For now, Achilles was simply a child, and like all children of noble birth in ancient Greece, he needed an education. Peleus, now raising his son alone after Thetis had departed for the sea, knew that Achilles required more than an ordinary upbringing. The boy already showed signs of extraordinary ability. He was stronger than children twice his age, faster, more coordinated. He needed a teacher who could handle such a prodigy, who could channel this raw potential into something magnificent. Peleus turned to an old friend, the centaur Chiron. In Greek mythology, centaurs were usually depicted as wild, violent creatures, half man and half horse, barely more than animals despite their human torsos. They were known for drunkenness, for abducting women, for causing chaos wherever they went. They lived in the mountains and forests, far from civilization, and most Greeks feared and avoided them. But Chiron was different, completely, fundamentally different. He was not born from the same bloodline as the other centaurs. While most centaurs were the spawn of Ixion, a king who had tried to seduce Hera and had been tricked into mating with a cloud in her image, Chiron's parentage was far more august. His father was Cronus himself, the great Titan who had once ruled the cosmos before being overthrown by Zeus. His mother was Philyra, a sea nymph. The story of Chiron's conception was itself remarkable. Cronus, while still married to Rhea, had pursued Philyra with amorous intent. When Rhea approached and nearly caught them together, Cronus quickly transformed himself into a horse to avoid detection. The coupling that occurred while he was in this form resulted in Chiron's unique nature, a being that was part human, part horse, but entirely noble in spirit. Philyra was horrified when she gave birth to this strange hybrid child and abandoned him. But Apollo, the god of prophecy, music, and healing, found the infant Chiron and took him under his divine protection. Apollo taught Chiron the arts of music and medicine, prophecy, and archery. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, taught him hunting. Under their tutelage, Chiron became not just wise, but supremely learned in all the arts that mattered to Greek civilization. He lived in a cave on Mount Pelion in Thessaly, far from the other centaurs, and there he established what could be called the ancient world's most exclusive school. The greatest heroes of Greek mythology, one after another, were sent to Chiron to be educated. Jason, who would lead the Argonauts, Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine, Actaeon, Meleager, Heracles himself, the greatest of all Greek heroes before Achilles, had learned at Chiron's feet. To Chiron's cave on Mount Pelion, Peleus brought his young son. The setting was wild and beautiful, high mountain air, pine forests that seemed to touch the clouds, streams that ran cold and clear from melting snow. This was Chiron's domain, and it was here that Achilles would spend his formative years, far from palaces and cities, learning to be a hero. What did Chiron teach him? Everything. And he taught it in a way that would forge not just a warrior, but a complete hero. The boy's diet was extraordinary, designed to build strength and ferocity. Chiron fed Achilles the innards of lions, believing that by consuming the organs of such a powerful predator, the boy would absorb their courage and fearlessness. He fed him wild boar, dangerous beasts that took skill and bravery to hunt, creatures whose meat was tough and required strong jaws to chew. He gave him the marrow of she-wolves, animals known for their fierce protection of their young and their ability to hunt in coordinated packs. This was not food for comfort, but fuel for transformation, each meal a ritual that connected the boy to the qualities of the beasts he consumed. Chiron taught Achilles to hunt, and in doing so, taught him far more than just how to kill. He taught him to move through the forest like a shadow, to place each foot with care so that not even a twig would snap beneath his weight. He taught him to read signs in bent grass and disturbed earth, to understand which way the wind was blowing and how that would carry his scent to his prey. He taught him to understand the behavior of prey and predator alike, to know when a deer would bolt and when it would freeze, to recognize the territorial markings of bears and the trails worn by wild pigs returning to their wallows. He taught him to survive in the wilderness, far from the comforts of civilization, which plants could be eaten and which were poison, how to find water by following the flight of birds at dusk or reading the pattern of vegetation, how to build shelter from branches and leaves, how to start fire without flint and steel, how to withstand harsh weather by understanding how animals protected themselves from the elements. There were exercises that pushed Achilles beyond what seemed possible. Chiron would make the young boy stand in fast-flowing rivers until his legs were numb from the cold, the current threatening to sweep him away. This taught him to endure discomfort, to push through pain, to find stability even when everything around him was trying to knock him down. The centaur would scold and threaten when Achilles faltered, teaching him that weakness was not acceptable, that a warrior must continue even when his body screamed at him to stop. But Chiron's teaching went far beyond mere physical prowess. He taught Achilles medicine, the knowledge of herbs and healing that Apollo had taught him centuries before. The boy learned which plants could ease pain, which could close wounds and stop bleeding, which could fight the fevers that followed infected injuries. He learned to set broken bones, to recognize the signs of internal damage, to treat battlefield injuries that would kill a man if left unattended. In Homer's Iliad, we see Achilles use this knowledge to treat wounded soldiers, showing a side of the warrior that pure fighters would not possess. This compassion, this ability to heal as well as hurt, was as much a part of Chiron's curriculum as swordsmanship. Music and poetry were part of the education as well. And this might seem strange to modern ears when we're talking about training a warrior. But the Greeks understood something important about the nature of a complete human being. Chiron taught Achilles to play the lyre, to feel the rhythm of strings beneath his fingers, to understand how melody and harmony could move the soul. He taught him the old songs and stories, the epics of heroes who had come before, the histories of gods and their dealings with mankind. Through poetry, Achilles learned about honor and shame, about what it meant to be remembered, about the choices that defined a man's legacy. A warrior who knew only violence was barely better than a beast, but a warrior who understood beauty, who could create as well as destroy, who knew the weight of words and the power of memory. That was something greater. The centaur taught him horsemanship, though in truth, Chiron himself served as Achilles' first mount. There's something both practical and deeply symbolic in this. The boy would ride on Chiron's back through the mountain passes, learning balance and coordination, learning to move with, rather than against, the motion beneath him. But he was also learning to trust a being who was profoundly different from himself, to see past appearances to the character underneath. Chiron would gallop through narrow trails where rocks jutted from both sides, would leap across streams and climb steep hillsides, all while Achilles clung to him, the boy laughing with joy at the speed and freedom, learning through experience rather than instruction. He taught him archery, the art of the bow that both Apollo and Artemis had mastered. The draw of the string, the aim that must account for distance and wind, the moment of perfect stillness before release. Achilles became skilled with the bow, though in later life he would be better known for spear and sword. And he taught him something else, something harder to define, but perhaps most important of all. Chiron taught Achilles about justice, about honor, about the complex moral questions that warriors must face. When is it right to kill? When is mercy more powerful than vengeance? What does it mean to be a hero, and what responsibilities come with great power? The ancient sources describe Chiron as not just a teacher, but a father figure to Achilles. The boy called him father. They shared a bond that went beyond instruction, a genuine love between teacher and student. Chiron was both strict and affectionate, demanding excellence while also providing the warmth and guidance that Thetis, in her absence, could not give. In some versions of the story, Achilles did not train alone on Mount Pelion. His closest companion, a boy named Patroclus, joined him there. Patroclus was the son of Menœtius, himself one of the Argonauts who had sailed with Peleus. As a young child, Patroclus had been involved in a terrible accident. During a game of dice, he had gotten into an argument with another boy and, in a moment of rage, killed him. It was not premeditated murder, but manslaughter, an accident born of youthful temper. Still, the penalty was exile. Patroclus's father sent him to the court of Peleus to atone for his crime and to be raised away from the scene of his disgrace. Peleus took him in and, recognizing that Patroclus was older than Achilles by a few years, arranged for the two boys to be raised together. Some versions of the myth suggest that Patroclus accompanied Achilles to Chiron's cave, and the two were educated side by side, though other sources have them meeting later in life. They formed a bond that would become legendary. The exact nature of their relationship, whether they were lovers or the closest of friends, has been interpreted differently across the ages. Ancient sources themselves varied in how they portrayed this bond. But what remains undeniable across all versions is that they loved each other deeply, that they were two halves of a whole, that each would eventually prove willing to die for the other. Where Achilles was impulsive and fierce, Patroclus was thoughtful and gentle. Where Achilles blazed like fire, Patroclus was steady like stone. Patroclus tempered Achilles' rage, served as his conscience, his better nature made manifest. And Achilles, in turn, gave Patroclus courage, strength, a reason to be more than he had been. They grew up together under Chiron's care, learning the same lessons, sharing the same dangers and triumphs. They hunted together in the forests of Pelion, chased by Chiron when they got too confident and needed to be reminded of humility. They learned to fight together, to read each other's movements, to work as a single unit. They were brothers in all but blood, and their friendship would become one of the most powerful driving forces in the entire Trojan War. The years passed. Achilles grew from boy to young man, and his prowess became impossible to ignore. He was already the greatest warrior in Greece, possibly the greatest who had ever lived. He was swift beyond belief, earning him the epithet swift-footed Achilles that Homer would use again and again. He was strong enough to wield the great ashen spear that Chiron had given to Peleus, a weapon so heavy that few men could even lift it. He was skilled with sword and spear, with bow and shield. He was everything Chiron had hoped to make him, and more. But the peaceful days on Mount Pelion could not last forever. The world beyond the mountain was moving toward war, and Achilles was about to be swept up in events that would fulfill every prophecy spoken about him. It began with an apple. That golden apple that Eris had thrown into the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis, inscribed with those 3 words, "For the fairest." The dispute over that apple had never been resolved. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each still claimed it. Their rivalry festered and grew until finally Zeus, tired of their bickering and wise enough to know that he could not judge between them without making 2 powerful enemies, decreed that a mortal would make the choice. The mortal he selected was Paris, a prince of Troy, young and beautiful and foolish. Paris was asked to judge which of the 3 goddesses was fairest, and each goddess offered him a bribe in exchange for his vote. Hera offered him power, the rule over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and glory in war. Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, thinking more with desire than with wisdom, chose Aphrodite. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus himself and a mortal queen. Helen had been sought by every prince and king in Greece. Her beauty was so extraordinary that it seemed to transcend the mortal realm entirely. When the time came for her to choose a husband, her mortal father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, had been terrified. He knew that whichever man won Helen's hand, all the rejected suitors would be furious, possibly furious enough to start a war. So before Helen made her choice, Tyndareus required all the suitors to swear a sacred oath. They would respect Helen's decision, and more than that, they would all defend whichever man she chose. If anyone ever wronged Helen's husband, all the former suitors would band together to make it right. It was a brilliant political move, turning potential enemies into duty-bound allies. Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, brother to the powerful Agamemnon, who ruled Mycenae. For years, their marriage was happy and peaceful, but Aphrodite had made a promise to Paris, and goddesses do not forget their promises. Paris came to Sparta as a guest, protected by the sacred laws of hospitality. Menelaus welcomed him, treated him with honor, gave him gifts and a place at his table. And Paris repaid this hospitality by seducing Helen. Whether she went willingly or was compelled by Aphrodite's power depends on which version you hear, and fleeing with her back to Troy, taking also a considerable amount of Menelaus's treasure. When Menelaus discovered that his wife and his wealth were gone, his rage was volcanic. He went immediately to his brother Agamemnon, and together they began calling in the oath. Every man who had once sought Helen's hand was now obligated to help retrieve her. One by one, the greatest warriors and kings of Greece answered the call, but there was one problem. Achilles had never been one of Helen's suitors. He had been too young, still in training with Chiron when Helen was choosing her husband. He owed no oath, had no obligation to go to war, and Thetis, knowing the prophecy of her son's death, was determined that he would not go. She knew that a war was brewing, knew that her son would be sought out for his prowess. She knew the prophecy about his two possible fates, and she wanted desperately for him to choose long life over glory. So she took him from Pelion and hid him on the island of Scyros, in the court of King Lycomedes. The plan was clever. Thetis disguised Achilles as a girl and placed him among Lycomedes' daughters. There, dressed in women's clothing and living as one of the princesses, Achilles would be safe. No one would think to look for the great warrior among a flock of maidens. For a time, it worked. Achilles lived on Scyros under a feminine name. It was not without its awkwardness. Here was this magnificent warrior, at the peak of his youth and strength, forced to hide his true nature, to pretend to be something he was not. According to some versions of the myth, during his time on Scyros, Achilles had a relationship with Deidamia, one of King Lycomedes' daughters, and she bore him a son, Neoptolemus, who would later join the war at Troy. But he did it for his mother's sake, because he knew her fear came from love. The disguise could not last, however, because the Greeks desperately needed Achilles. A seer named Calchas had delivered a prophecy about the Trojan War. Troy could not be taken without Achilles. Without him, the greatest city in Asia would never fall. The Greeks would fail, and Helen would never be recovered. They had to find him. The task of locating Achilles fell to Odysseus, king of Ithaca, known for his cunning and craftiness. Odysseus had actually tried to avoid the war himself, feigning madness when Agamemnon's messengers came to call him to service. But his ruse had been discovered, and now he was committed to the cause. If he had to go, he was determined that Achilles would go too. Odysseus tracked down the rumors of where Achilles might be hidden. He came to Scyros dressed as a merchant, carrying a pack full of goods to sell. He laid out his wares before the daughters of King Lycomedes, a glittering array of jewelry, fine fabrics, mirrors, perfumes, all the things that might interest young women. But hidden among these feminine goods were also a sword and a spear, weapons of finest quality. The daughters of Lycomedes crowded around, admiring the jewelry and cloth. They held up mirrors, tested perfumes, giggled over the pretty things. All except one. One of the supposed maidens ignored the jewelry and moved straight to the weapons. This person picked up the spear, tested its weight and balance with the practiced ease of someone who had trained for years. The disguise fell away in an instant. Achilles was revealed. In some versions of the story, Odysseus added an additional twist. He had an alarm sounded, a fake attack on the palace. While the daughters screamed and fled, Achilles instinctively grabbed weapons and prepared to fight. Either way, Odysseus had found his man. Achilles must have felt a complex mixture of emotions in that moment. Relief that the pretense was over, perhaps. Anticipation of the glory that war promised. But also the weight of his mother's fears, the knowledge of what his choice would mean. Thetis confronted him one more time. She laid out the prophecy in clear terms. He could stay on Scyros, live a long life, marry, have children, die old and comfortable. His great-great-grandchildren might know his name, but no one else would. Remember him. Or he could go to Troy, become the greatest warrior of his age, achieve glory that would never fade, and die young, far from home, his body returned to Greece in a funeral urn. What would you choose? Obscurity and safety, or immortality and death? Achilles made his choice. He chose glory. Perhaps it was never really a choice at all. Perhaps Achilles was the kind of man who could only ever make one decision. He was a warrior born, bred for battle, trained his entire life for this moment. How could he possibly turn away from the only thing he was made for? He joined the Greek expedition, and with him came Patroclus, his oldest friend, unwilling to let Achilles face war alone. Together, they would sail for Troy, and nothing would ever be the same. The Greek fleet that assembled at Aulis was unlike anything the world had seen before. Over 1,000 ships filled the harbour, black-hulled war vessels with proud prows and banks of oars. Each ship carried 50 men or more, warriors from every corner of Greece. There were kings and princes, legendary heroes whose names would echo through history. Agamemnon commanded the fleet, the High King of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in Greece. His brother Menelaus was there, of course, the wronged husband seeking to reclaim his wife. Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, a mountain of a man nearly as formidable as Achilles himself. Ajax the Lesser, swift and fierce. Diomedes of Argos, young but already renowned for his courage. Old Nestor of Pylos, who had outlived 2 generations of men and was full of wisdom and long-winded stories. Odysseus of Ithaca, clever and strategic. Idomeneus of Crete, and dozens more, each leading their own contingents, each with their own reasons for joining the war. Achilles brought 50 ships, filled with the warriors he commanded, the Myrmidons. These were men from Phthia and the surrounding regions, fiercely loyal to Achilles and his father Peleus. According to legend, they descended from ants that had been transformed into men by Zeus, hence their name, which comes from the Greek word for ant. This origin story, whether literal or symbolic, spoke to their nature as warriors. They fought with the coordination and discipline of an insect hive, moving as one, never breaking formation, absolutely devoted to their leader. At their head was Achilles, and at Achilles' side was Patroclus. The two were inseparable, sharing a tent, eating from the same fires, planning strategy together. The other Greeks noticed their closeness and recognized it as something profound, though few understood its full depth. The fleet set sail from Aulis and crossed the Aegean Sea, that dark wine-colored expanse between Greece and Asia. They landed on the shores of Troy, the great city rising on its hill in the distance, its walls built by Poseidon himself, rising high and seemingly impenetrable. Troy was not some minor city-state. It was a wealthy, powerful civilization that controlled the trade routes between east and west. Its walls were legendary, its warriors numerous and skilled. King Priam ruled there, an old man but still strong in authority, and his sons were among the best fighters in the world. Chief among them was Hector, the crown prince, the shield of Troy, a warrior who many said was second only to Achilles himself. The war that followed would last for 10 years. 10 long years of siege and battle, of victories and defeats, of heroes falling and new heroes rising. It would become the most famous war in all of Greek mythology, the subject of countless songs and stories, the backdrop against which the greatest deeds of heroism and the darkest acts of cruelty would unfold. The early years of the war saw Achilles at his most fearsome. While the main Greek army held the siege lines around Troy, Achilles led raids into the surrounding countryside. He attacked the cities and towns that were allied with Troy, cutting off their supplies, capturing their treasures, taking prisoners who could be sold as slaves or ransomed. He captured 12 cities by sea and 11 by land, a devastating campaign that made his name terrifying to everyone in the region. He moved through battle like a force of nature. His speed was supernatural. Opponents would blink, and he would be upon them, his great spear finding their throats before they could raise their shields. He fought, not with wild abandon, but with precision and economy of movement, every thrust and parry exactly as it needed to be. Chiron's training had made him perfect, a natural talent had made him unstoppable. The Trojans learned to fear the sight of him. When Achilles entered the field, wearing his magnificent bronze armor, carrying the great ashwood spear that only he could wield, leading the disciplined ranks of the Myrmidons, even the bravest Trojan warriors felt their courage waver. He was death made manifest, swift and terrible, and absolutely certain. But Achilles was not the only Greek hero achieving glory in those early years. Diomedes performed astounding feats, even wounding gods when they interfered in battle. Ajax stood like an immovable wall, his famous shield turning aside every attack. Odysseus used strategy and cunning to win victories that brute force could not achieve. The war was hard fought on both sides, with heroes on both sides earning fame through their deeds. And yet, for all the battles and bloodshed, Troy did not fall. The walls held. The Trojan warriors, led by Hector, fought with desperation and skill. They were defending their homes, their families, their very lives. The Greeks were far from their own lands, growing weary with each passing year, watching their numbers diminish as disease and battle took their toll. By the 10th year of the war, frustration ran high on both sides. The Greeks were no closer to taking Troy than they had been at the beginning. The Trojans could not drive the Greeks away. It was in this atmosphere of deadlock and exhaustion that the events of Homer's Iliad begin, the events that would change Achilles forever. The catalyst was not a battle, but a quarrel. And like so many quarrels, it began over a woman. During one of his raids, Achilles had captured a young woman named Briseis. She was from Lionessus, a city allied with Troy, and she had been given to Achilles as his prize, his reward for the victory. The Greeks practiced this kind of warfare. Captured women became slaves, property of the men who claimed them. It's a brutal reality that we might find horrifying today, but in the world of the ancient Greeks, it was simply how war worked. Achilles had grown attached to Briseis. Whether he loved her, whether their relationship had any genuine affection, or was purely transactional, the sources disagree. But she was his, awarded to him by right of conquest, and he valued her. At the same time, Agamemnon, the commander of all the Greek forces, had taken his own war prize, a woman named Chryseis. She was the daughter of Chrysis, a priest of Apollo. The old priest came to the Greek camp, bearing a fortune in ransom, begging Agamemnon to return his daughter. He called upon Apollo, his patron god, to witness his plea. Agamemnon refused. He liked Chryseis, he said, liked her more than his own wife back home in Mycenae. He ordered the priest driven away, threatened him with violence if he returned. It was a profound insult, not just to the priest, but to Apollo himself. Apollo's response was swift and terrible. He sent a plague upon the Greek army. Soldiers began to sicken and die, not from battle, but from disease. First, a few men fell ill, then dozens, then hundreds. Funeral pyres burned day and night as the Greeks tried to honor their dead. The situation grew desperate. Finally, Calchas the seer revealed the truth. Apollo was punishing the Greeks for the insult to his priest. The plague would not end until Chryseis was returned to her father without ransom, with full honors. Only then would Apollo withdraw his wrath. The army pressured Agamemnon to comply. He had no choice. Not if he wanted to have any army left to command, but he was furious at being forced to give up his prize. So he agreed to return Chryseis, but he demanded compensation. If he was losing his war prize, he declared, he would take someone else's, and he would take the best prize in the entire camp. He would take Briseis from Achilles. This was more than just the seizure of property. It was a deliberate insult, an abuse of power, a public humiliation of the greatest warrior in the Greek army. Agamemnon was essentially saying that his authority as commander outweighed Achilles' achievements as a warrior, that he could take whatever he wanted, regardless of who had earned it. The confrontation between Achilles and Agamemnon is one of the most powerful scenes in all of Greek literature. The entire army gathered to witness it, and both men knew that this was about more than just one woman. It was about honor, about authority, about the very structure of their society. Achilles spoke first, and his words were like daggers. He called Agamemnon greedy, shameless, a dog wearing a king's crown. He pointed out that he, Achilles, had fought harder than anyone, had captured more cities, killed more enemies, earned more glory, and yet Agamemnon, who stayed safely away from the front lines, felt entitled to take the rewards. He questioned why any Greek should fight for Agamemnon at all, if this was how he treated his best warriors. Agamemnon responded with his own fury. He said that Achilles might be the best fighter, but he, Agamemnon, was the king. His authority came from Zeus himself. If Achilles didn't like it, he was welcome to leave, to take his Myrmidons and sail home to Greece. But Briseis was now his, and there was nothing Achilles could do about it. For a moment, a terrible moment, Achilles' hand moved to his sword. He could kill Agamemnon right there. It would be easy. One swift strike and the king of Mycenae would be dead at his feet. Part of Achilles wanted to do it, wanted to punish this insult with blood and steel. But then Athena appeared to him. Only he could see her. She grabbed his hair from behind, stayed his hand, spoke words that made him reconsider. If he killed Agamemnon now, the Greek expedition would collapse. There would be no glory, no war, no chance to fulfill his destiny. And besides, she promised, Agamemnon would pay for this insult threefold. So Achilles made a different choice. He did not draw his sword. Instead, he made a vow. He would not fight. He would remain in the Greek camp, but he would not take up arms. Not for Agamemnon, not for the Greek cause, not for anything. Let the commander see how well his war went without Achilles. Let the Trojans slaughter the Greeks on the beaches. Let Agamemnon watch his army die and know that it was his own arrogance and greed that had caused it. Agamemnon's men came and took Briseis away. She went reluctantly, weeping, casting looks back at Achilles. And Achilles let her go. He did not resist, did not fight, but his rage was like a fire that would not be quenched. He went to the shore, away from the camp, and called out to his mother. Thetis heard him, rose from the depths of the sea, and listened to his anguish. He told her everything, the insult, the humiliation, the oath he had sworn, and he asked her for a favor. She had power with Zeus, had once helped save him from a rebellion. Could she persuade Zeus to help the Trojans, to let them drive the Greeks back, to make Agamemnon see how much he needed Achilles? Thetis agreed. She went to Olympus and pleaded with Zeus, and the king of gods, after some reluctance, agreed to grant her request. He would allow the Trojans to win victories, would hold back his support of the Greeks until Agamemnon learned his lesson. And so began the disaster that nearly destroyed the Greek army. Without Achilles, the balance of the war shifted dramatically. Hector, leading the Trojan forces, pushed forward with renewed aggression. The Greeks, who had relied so heavily on Achilles' prowess, found themselves driven back again and again. Battles that should have been victories became defeats. Warriors who had felt invincible now felt the cold touch of fear. Agamemnon tried to rally his forces, but his authority had been undermined by his own actions. How could he demand loyalty and bravery from his men when he had treated their greatest hero so shamefully? Some of the other Greek leaders, seeing the damage caused by this quarrel, tried to mediate. They begged Achilles to return, offered him gifts and honors, even promised that Briseis would be returned to him. Odysseus, Ajax, and old Phoenix, who had been one of Achilles' teachers as a child, all came to his tent and pleaded with him. But Achilles refused. His rage was not something that could be bought off with treasure. This was about more than material compensation. His honor had been violated, his contributions dismissed, his value as a warrior ignored. Agamemnon had treated him not as a hero, but as a servant, someone whose achievements could be casually taken away. Until Agamemnon himself came and begged forgiveness, until the insult was publicly acknowledged and atoned for, Achilles would not fight. The war continued without him, and the Greeks suffered. The Trojans, emboldened by their success, pushed all the way to the Greek ships. They brought fire, intending to burn the fleet and leave the Greeks stranded in Troy, unable to return home, at the mercy of Trojan swords. It was then that Patroclus, watching the slaughter from Achilles' tent, could no longer bear it. He had been with Achilles through everything, had supported his friend's withdrawal from battle, had understood his rage. But now Greek warriors were dying by the hundreds. These were men they knew, comrades who had sailed with them from Greece, friends who deserved better than to die because of a quarrel between two proud leaders. Patroclus went to Achilles and begged him to reconsider. The Greeks needed help. Honor could be settled later. Right now, men were dying. If Achilles would not fight, Then let Patroclus fight in his place. Let him wear Achilles' armor, carry Achilles' shield, lead the Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans would see what they thought was Achilles entering the fight and would fall back in fear. It might be enough to drive them away from the ships, to give the Greeks breathing room. Achilles was torn. He loved Patroclus, would do anything for him. But he had also sworn not to fight until the Greeks were in such desperate straits that even Agamemnon would be forced to acknowledge his mistake. Letting Patroclus fight felt like breaking that oath, like giving in too easily. But Patroclus insisted, and in the end, Achilles agreed, but with conditions. Patroclus could wear his armor, could lead the Myrmidons, could drive the Trojans back from the ships. But he must not go further. He must not pursue the Trojans to their walls, must not try to storm Troy itself. His mission was simply to save the ships and then return. "Promise me," Achilles said. "Promise you'll come back." Patroclus promised. He put on Achilles' armor, the magnificent bronze that had been forged by gods and won in battle. He took up the great shield, the heavy spear that Achilles wielded. He looked every bit the great hero, and the Myrmidons, seeing their leader's armor and shield, rallied around him with joy and ferocity. They thought Achilles had returned to the fight at last. Patroclus led them onto the battlefield, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. The Trojans, seeing what they believed was Achilles charging toward them with the Myrmidons at his back, felt their courage evaporate. They had learned to fear that armor, those weapons, that unstoppable force. They broke and ran, without even engaging, scrambling over each other in their haste to escape. The psychological impact of Achilles returning to battle, or so they thought, was more powerful than any weapon. Patroclus fought brilliantly that day, moving through the battle with a skill that, while not quite equal to Achilles, was still formidable and deadly. He drove the Trojans back from the ships, saving the Greek fleet from destruction. His spear found target after target. He killed warrior after warrior, each death a small victory, each fallen Trojan another step back from the brink of disaster. The Greeks rallied around him, their spirits lifted by what they believed was Achilles' return. They surged forward with renewed energy, pushing the Trojans back across the plain. Among those who fell to Patroclus' spear was Sarpedon, son of Zeus himself, king of Lycia, and one of Troy's most important allies. This was no ordinary kill. Sarpedon was a demigod, a hero in his own right, commander of warriors who had traveled far to fight for Troy. When Patroclus killed him, it was a blow not just to the Trojan military, but to their morale. If even the son of Zeus could fall, then truly no one was safe. But it was this very success that became Patroclus' downfall. He became caught up in the glory of it all, swept away by the tide of victory. This was what it felt like to be Achilles, to be the hero everyone looked to be the one who turned the tide of battle. The Trojans fled before him, and Patroclus pursued, charging after them with increasing boldness. He forgot his promise. He forgot Achilles' warning to only drive them from the ships and then return. He chased the Trojans all the way back to the walls of Troy itself, drunk on success, intoxicated by the feeling of invincibility that came from wearing Achilles' armor. 3 times Patroclus charged at the walls themselves, trying to scale them, trying to break through. He climbed part way up, his hands finding purchase in the ancient stones, believing that perhaps he could breach Troy's defenses where so many others had failed. 3 times Apollo, watching from Olympus, struck him back. The god placed his immortal hand on Patroclus' chest and pushed, and the mortal warrior tumbled back to the ground, denied entry to the city. Then Apollo spoke, his voice carrying divine authority and warning. "Back, Patroclus," he said. "It is not fated that Troy should fall to your spear, nor even to Achilles' spear. Back away before you anger the gods further." But Patroclus, whether he didn't hear or didn't care, continued to press forward. He was too far gone, too committed to the momentum of battle. And Apollo, who favored the Trojans, who had sent the plague to punish Agamemnon, who wanted Troy to survive, decided that this mortal had gone too far. but Apollo was watching. Apollo, who favored the Trojans, who had sent the plague to punish Agamemnon, who wanted Troy to survive. He saw Patroclus approaching the walls and knew that this could not be allowed. The walls of Troy could not be breached, not yet, not until fate decreed it. Apollo descended to the battlefield, invisible to mortal eyes, and he struck Patroclus from behind. The blow dazed him, knocked his helmet from his head, shattered his spear, loosened his armor. Suddenly, Patroclus was vulnerable, confused, no longer protected by the armor of Achilles. In that moment, a Trojan warrior named Euphorbus saw his chance and drove a spear into Patroclus's back. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. Patroclus staggered, tried to fall back toward the Greek lines, but Hector had seen what happened. Hector, the great prince of Troy, who had been fighting all day, who had killed many Greeks, now saw the supposed Achilles wounded and vulnerable. Hector strode forward, and Patroclus, weakened and disoriented, could not defend himself. Hector's spear found its mark, driving deep into Patroclus's stomach. Patroclus fell to his knees, then collapsed onto his side in the dust and blood of the battlefield. As he lay dying, Hector stood over him and mocked him, claiming glory for killing the great Achilles. But Patroclus, with his last breaths, told Hector the truth. He was not Achilles. Achilles still lived, and when he learned what had happened, his vengeance would be terrible. Hector had killed Patroclus, but in doing so, he had sealed his own doom. Then Patroclus died, and the Greeks around him cried out in horror and grief. News travels fast on a battlefield, carried on the wind of rumor and fear. Word spread through the Greek lines that Patroclus had fallen, that the man wearing Achilles' armor had been killed by Hector. A fierce battle erupted over Patroclus's body. Hector wanted to take it as a trophy, to strip the armor and drag the corpse behind his chariot, as an insult to the Greeks. But Ajax and Menelaus, along with other Greek warriors, fought desperately to protect their fallen comrade. They formed a shield wall around the body, fending off wave after wave of Trojan attacks, buying time for the terrible news to reach the man who needed to hear it most. Antilochus, son of old Nestor, was given the grim task of running to Achilles' tent and delivering the message. He found Achilles there, waiting, already filled with a sense of dread. Somehow, he already knew something had gone terribly wrong. When Antilochus, weeping, told him that Patroclus was dead, that Hector had killed him, that the Trojans had stripped Achilles' armor from the body, something inside Achilles shattered. The grief that overtook him was beyond anything he had ever felt, beyond anything that words could fully capture. He fell to the ground as if his legs had been cut out from under him. He took handfuls of dust and ash from the hearth and poured them over his head, an ancient gesture of mourning that turned his golden hair grey and matted. He tore at his clothes with such violence that the fabric shredded in his hands. He tore at his own hair, pulled it out in clumps. The cries that came from him were not human. They were the howls of a wounded animal, raw and terrible and filled with a pain so deep it seemed to come from the very core of his being. The sound carried across the camp, and Greeks who heard it felt their blood run cold. Battle-hardened warriors who had seen countless horrors in 10 years of war stopped what they were doing, their hands frozen on their tasks, because they recognized in that sound something primal, something that spoke to every human fear of loss. Even the Trojans in their distant city, some said, could hear that cry echoing across the plain, and they knew that something terrible had shifted in the war. Achilles' servant women, captured in earlier raids, came running to see what had happened. When they saw their lord on the ground, covered in ash, grief-stricken beyond measure, they too began to wail. They wept for Patroclus, yes, but they also wept for their own sorrows, for their lost homes and families, for everything the war had taken from them. Grief is contagious. It spreads like fire through dry grass, and soon the entire camp seemed to echo with lamentation. Thetis heard her son's anguish from the depths of the sea. She rose once more, bringing with her a group of her sister Nereids, and they came to Achilles' side. They found him destroyed by grief, broken in a way that no weapon had ever broken him. Thetis held him as he wept, and she wept with him, because she knew what this meant. She had known it always, had feared it from the moment of his birth. Patroclus's death had set everything in motion. Achilles would return to battle now. He would kill Hector. And then, soon after, Achilles himself would die. She told him this, reminded him of the prophecy. "If you go back to the fight," she said, "if you kill Hector to avenge Patroclus, your own death will follow quickly after. You could still live. You could still choose the long life, return to Greece, have children, grow old." But Achilles, through his tears, said no. What was the point of living if Patroclus was dead? What good was a long life if it was empty of meaning, if he had failed to protect the person he loved most? Better to have a short life with purpose than a long life filled with regret and shame. He had let Patroclus go into battle wearing his armor, had failed to protect him, had broken his promise. The least he could do now was avenge him. He would kill Hector, even if it meant his own death would follow. The choice Thetis had offered him years ago, the choice between long life and glory, had been made again, and his answer was the same. Thetis knew she could not change his mind, so instead, she tried to help him. His armor had been stripped from Patroclus's body and was now in Hector's possession. If Achilles was going to return to battle, he would need new armor, armor worthy of the greatest warrior in the world. She went to Olympus, to the forge of Hephaestus, the smith god, craftsman of the immortals. She begged him to create armor for her son, armor that would protect him, armor that would be remembered forever. Hephaestus, who had always been grateful to Thetis for kindnesses she had shown him in the past, agreed. All through the night, the god worked. His forges blazed with divine fire. His hammer rang against imperishable bronze and gold and silver. He crafted a breastplate that no mortal weapon could penetrate, greaves that fit perfectly to Achilles' legs, a helmet that gleamed like a star. But the masterpiece, the creation that would be sung about for thousands of years, was the shield. Hephaestus made Achilles a shield unlike any other. It was massive, perfectly balanced, decorated with scenes so detailed and intricate that they seemed almost alive. The shield depicted the entire cosmos, from the stars above to the earth below. It showed cities at peace and cities at war, farmers bringing in harvests and warriors locked in battle. It showed weddings and funerals, law courts and festivals. It was the world in miniature, all of human existence captured in bronze and precious metals. At dawn, Thetis brought the armor to her son. The Greeks gathered to see it, awed by its beauty and craftsmanship. Achilles looked at it and saw not just protection, but purpose. This was armor fit for legend, armor that would carry his name through the ages. He put it on, and he became something more than human, something terrible and magnificent and utterly focused on a single purpose, the death of Hector. But before he could return to battle, there was the matter of Agamemnon. The quarrel that had started all of this needed to be resolved, at least publicly. Agamemnon, seeing what was about to happen, knowing that Achilles would soon rejoin the fight, saw his opportunity to make amends without losing too much face. He called an assembly of the Greek army. Before all the gathered warriors, he apologized to Achilles. He claimed that he had been driven mad by the gods, that it was not truly his fault. It was a half-hearted apology, one that preserved his pride while acknowledging his mistake. He offered gifts, tripods and cauldrons, horses and gold. Even Briseis returned unharmed, along with 7 other women. The material compensation was enormous. Achilles barely cared about any of it. He accepted Agamemnon's apology not because he was truly satisfied, but because holding on to the grudge no longer mattered. The quarrel seemed petty now, insignificant compared to the loss of Patroclus. He wanted only one thing: to get onto the battlefield and find Hector. The assembly ended, and the Greeks prepared for battle. They armed themselves, formed their lines, made offerings to the gods. But none of their preparations matched the terrible simplicity of Achilles' readiness. He put on his divine armor, took up a new spear, and walked toward the battlefield with murder in his heart. The Myrmidons fell in behind him, their loyalty to their leader unshaken despite all that had happened. They moved out as a unit, a disciplined force of destruction with Achilles at their head. When the Trojans saw him coming, saw the real Achilles this time, wearing armor that blazed in the sunlight like captured fire, they knew that death itself was walking toward them. What followed was not battle in the traditional sense. It was slaughter, pure and unrelenting. Achilles cut through the Trojan ranks like a scythe through wheat, and the wheat had no chance of fighting back. He was everywhere at once, his speed so supernatural that Trojans would see him killing a man 30 paces to their left, and then suddenly he was upon them, his spear already in motion. Every thrust of his spear found a throat or heart, every swing of his sword opened a chest or severed a limb. He killed with such efficiency that there seemed to be no wasted movement, no excess effort. Each death was precise, economical, perfect. The Trojans tried to stand against him at first. They formed shield walls, locked their defenses together, braced themselves for his charge. But when Achilles hit those formations, they shattered like pottery struck by a hammer. Warriors who had held their ground against Greek attacks for years broke and fled when they saw Achilles coming. His reputation preceded him like a wave of terror, and men who might have been brave in any other circumstance found their courage dissolving when they looked into his eyes and saw nothing but death. He did not kill with cold precision now, as he had in earlier battles. He killed with rage, with grief, with a fury that could not be satisfied, no matter how much blood he spilled. There was no mercy in him, no hesitation, no moment of doubt. When wounded Trojans fell and raised their hands in surrender, begging for their lives or offering ransom, Achilles struck them down without a word. When he encountered young warriors barely out of boyhood, he showed them no pity. The rage that consumed him made no distinctions between the guilty and the innocent, between combatants and those who simply had the misfortune to be in his path. He chased fleeing Trojans into the Scamander River, and the clear water turned red with their blood. He killed them as they tried to swim, pulling them under, stabbing them as they surfaced, gasping for air. He killed so many men in that river that their bodies began to clog the current, damming the flow. The river itself became choked with corpses, and the river god Scamander rose up in anger, his voice like rushing rapids, protesting this pollution of his sacred waters. The god sent waves crashing toward Achilles, trying to drown him, to sweep him away. But even against divine wrath, Achilles would not stop. He pushed through rising waters and divine fury to continue his hunt, his single-minded pursuit of the one man he truly wanted to kill. He was looking for one man, Hector, the prince of Troy, the man who had killed Patroclus. The other Trojans, seeing the destruction Achilles was causing, fled back to the safety of their walls. They poured through the gates of Troy, seeking refuge behind the impregnable defenses that had protected them for 10 years. Only Hector remained outside. King Priam, watching from the walls, begged his son to come inside. Priam was old enough to have lived through generations of conflict, old enough to know that pride was worth less than life. He called out to Hector, told him not to face Achilles alone, to let the walls protect him. Hecuba, Hector's mother, stood beside Priam and added her own pleas. "Come inside," she said. "Do not throw your life away." But Hector could not. The previous day, he had urged the Trojans to camp outside the walls, confident that they could defeat the Greeks. That decision had led to massive casualties. Many good men had died because Hector had been overconfident. He had led them into disaster, and now he felt he could not retreat to safety while those men lay dead on the battlefield. His honor demanded that he face Achilles. There was another reason too. Hector had killed Patroclus. He knew that Achilles would not rest, would not stop, would keep attacking Troy until revenge was satisfied. Perhaps, Hector reasoned, if he fought Achilles in single combat, If he somehow managed to kill him, Troy would be saved. It was a desperate hope. But what else did he have? So Hector stood alone before the Scaean gates, waiting. Achilles came around the walls, still covered in blood from his rampage through the Trojan army. When he saw Hector waiting for him, he did not slow down. He came on like a predator, swift and certain. For a moment, seeing that terrible figure approaching, Hector's courage failed him. He ran. It was not cowardice, not really. It was the natural human response to overwhelming danger. Hector was brave, one of the bravest men who ever lived, but he was still human. And Achilles, in that moment, seemed like something beyond human, like death itself wearing flesh. 3 times they ran around the walls of Troy. Hector fled and Achilles pursued, neither slowing, neither gaining ground. The Trojans watched from the walls, frozen in horror. The Greeks watched from their lines, silent and awed. The gods themselves watched from Olympus, and Zeus took out his golden scales to weigh the fates of both men. In Zeus's scales, Hector's fate sank down toward death. Achilles' fate, for the moment, rose higher. Apollo, who had protected Hector throughout the war, sadly withdrew his divine support. The Prince of Troy was alone now. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, decided to intervene. She appeared to Hector in the form of his brother Deiphobus, who he trusted absolutely. Deiphobus told Hector to stop running, that they could face Achilles together, that 2 against 1 might prevail where 1 alone would fail. Heartened by the presence of his brother, Hector stopped and turned to face Achilles. But when he looked around for Deiphobus, he found that he was alone. It had been a trick, divine deception. Athena had vanished, and Hector realized in that terrible moment that the gods had abandoned him. This was his end, but he would not die running. If he was going to die, it would be with his face toward his enemy, with his sword in his hand. He drew himself up and faced Achilles. They spoke briefly before fighting. Hector tried to establish terms for the duel. "Let the winner treat the loser's body with respect," he said. "Let there be proper funeral rites, burial with honor, no desecration of the dead." These were the customs of warfare, the civilized rules that even enemies observed. Achilles refused. His voice was cold and terrible. "There would be no pact," he said. "Lions do not make treaties with men." He had only one desire: to hack Hector's body apart, to make him pay in blood and pain for what he had done to Patroclus. Then they fought. Hector threw his spear first. A good throw, well aimed. But Athena deflected it so that it missed Achilles entirely. Hector looked around for another spear, called out to Deiphobus to give him one. But of course, there was no Deiphobus. He was alone and unarmed except for his sword. Achilles charged forward with his spear. Hector raised his shield, tried to protect himself, but Achilles knew that armor, had worn it himself. He knew every gap, every weak point. His spear found the spot at the base of Hector's throat, where the collarbone met the neck, and drove through. Hector fell, the spear lodged in his throat. He could still speak, though blood bubbled from his mouth. With his dying breaths, he made a final plea. "Please," he said, "please give my body back to my family. Let my father ransom it. Let me have proper burial. Do not leave me to be eaten by dogs." Achilles, standing over him, said no. He wished he could devour Hector's flesh himself, eat it raw in his rage. There would be no ransom. There would be no respect. Hector would be left for the dogs and birds. Hector, dying, made one last prophecy. "You too will fall soon," he said. "Paris and Apollo will kill you at the Scaean gates. Your death is coming." Then Hector died, and his soul descended to the underworld, mourning the strength and youth that had been taken from him. But Achilles was not done. His rage was still not satisfied. He stripped Hector of his armor, the armor that had once been his own, the armor Hector had taken from Patroclus's body. Then he did something that horrified even the gods. He took leather straps and bound Hector's ankles. He tied those straps to his chariot, and then he dragged Hector's body around the walls of Troy, around and around, while Priam and Hecuba and all the Trojans watched and wailed from the walls. Hector's head bounced through the dust. His hair became matted with dirt and blood. His beautiful face was ruined. The greatest champion of Troy was being desecrated, treated worse than an animal. Achilles dragged the body back to the Greek camp and left it lying in the dirt beside Patroclus's funeral pyre. For 12 days, he continued to dishonor Hector's corpse, dragging it around Patroclus's tomb each morning, as if offering it as a sacrifice to his dead friend. But the gods would not allow this desecration to continue. Apollo protected Hector's body from decay and damage, keeping it whole despite the abuse. And finally, Zeus himself intervened. This had gone too far. Hector deserved burial. His family deserved to mourn. Zeus sent Thetis to speak to Achilles, to tell him that the gods demanded he return Hector's body, and Zeus sent a message to King Priam, telling him to go to the Greek camp at night, alone, except for a herald, bringing ransom for his son's body. Priam obeyed. The old king, who had lived through so much, who had seen so many of his sons die, took a wagon filled with treasure and drove through the darkness to the Greek camp. Hermes, disguised as a Greek soldier, guided him safely through the lines until he reached Achilles' tent. Priam entered the tent unannounced and did something that took more courage than any battle he had ever witnessed, more bravery than any of his sons had shown on the field of combat. He, a king who had ruled Troy for decades, who had sired 50 sons and countless daughters, who had commanded the respect and loyalty of the entire city, knelt before the man who had killed his son. He knelt before the destroyer of his family, the source of his deepest grief. He reached out and kissed Achilles' hands, the same hands that had driven a spear through Hector's throat, the hands that had slaughtered so many Trojans that the numbers had long since lost meaning. And he begged, not with the authority of a king, but with the desperate plea of a father. He spoke of Peleus, Achilles' own father, back in Greece. "Think of your own father," Priam said, his voice breaking. "Peleus is old now, as I am old. His hair is white, his body weak, his eyes dim. He waits for you to come home, counts the days until he can see his son again. Every time a ship arrives from Troy, he rushes to the harbor, hoping it carries news of you, hoping to see you walking down the gangplank. Have pity on me, as you would want someone to show pity to him if the situations were reversed. Have mercy on me, as you would want mercy shown to your own father in his grief. I have done what no other man on this earth has done," Priam continued. "I have entered the camp of my enemies alone. I have knelt before the greatest warrior of our age, the man who has killed more of my sons and grandsons than I can count without weeping. I have kissed the hands of the man who has brought such destruction to my city. I have done this because a father's love knows no pride, no dignity, no limit. Return my son to me. Let me bury him. Let me give him the honors he deserves. Do not leave him to rot, to be desecrated further. He was a good man, a brave warrior, a loving husband and father. He fought for his people, died defending those he loved. Whatever anger you feel toward him, toward Troy, toward the war itself, surely it can be set aside long enough to allow a father to mourn his child properly." Something broke in Achilles in that moment. The rage that had sustained him since Patroclus' death, that had driven him to such horrific acts of violence and desecration, finally began to cool. He looked at Priam kneeling before him, this old man with tears streaming down his face, and he saw not an enemy, but a mirror. He saw a father grieving for his son, just as Achilles grieved for Patroclus. He saw the universal human experience of loss, of love cut short by violence, of the terrible price that war extracts from everyone it touches. Achilles began to weep, and Priam wept with him, and for a long moment, in that tent far from home, surrounded by the trappings of war, The two enemies shared their grief as men, not as warriors or kings or representatives of their peoples. They wept for Hector. They wept for Patroclus. They wept for Peleus, aging alone in Greece. They wept for all the sons and brothers and friends who had died in this endless, pointless war. They wept because they were human, and humans break under the weight of such loss. Achilles agreed to return Hector's body. More than that, he promised a truce of 12 days so that Troy could hold proper funeral rites. He even helped Priam load the body onto the wagon with his own hands, treating it with gentleness that would have been unthinkable just hours before. Priam returned to Troy with his son's body, and the city mourned. They held elaborate funeral games, burning Hector's body with all the honors due to a prince and a hero. They sang his praises, remembered his courage, his devotion to his family and his city, and then they built a great tomb for him, knowing that Troy was doomed without him. Homer's Iliad ends here, with Hector's funeral, not with the fall of Troy or the death of Achilles. But the war continued, and the story of Achilles was not yet complete. After Hector's death, Troy called upon its remaining allies for help. From Ethiopia came King Memnon, a great warrior said to be the son of Eos, goddess of the dawn. He arrived with a fresh army and immediately began causing trouble for the Greeks. Memnon and Achilles met on the battlefield, and after a fierce duel, Achilles killed him. Eos mourned her son, and her tears became the morning dew that covers the earth each day. Then came the Amazons, a tribe of warrior women from the east. Their queen, Penthesilea, was renowned for her skill in battle. She came to Troy seeking glory, and was every bit as formidable as her reputation suggested. She and Achilles met in single combat. According to the most poignant version of this story, Achilles struck her down with his spear, but as she fell and their eyes met, he fell in love with her. Too late. She died, and Achilles mourned the woman who might have been his equal in another life. But Achilles himself was living on borrowed time. Hector's final prophecy haunted him, a countdown to an inevitable end. That prophecy was about to be fulfilled. The archer. Paris had never been a great warrior like his brother Hector. He was beautiful and charming, but not brave in the traditional sense. It had been Paris who started the war by abducting Helen, Paris who had avoided direct combat whenever possible. But now, with Hector dead and Troy desperate, Paris took up his bow. The sources disagree on exactly how Achilles' death occurred. In the most famous version, Paris shot an arrow at Achilles during the fighting near the Scaean gates. The arrow, guided by Apollo, god of archery, flew straight and true. It struck Achilles in the only vulnerable spot on his body, the heel where Thetis had held him when dipping him in the River Styx. The wound was mortal. Some accounts suggest the arrow was poisoned, which would explain how such a small wound could kill so mighty a warrior. The venom or infection spread from the wound through Achilles' body. The greatest warrior in the world, who had fought in countless battles, who had faced gods and monsters, was brought down by a single arrow to the heel. He fell, and the Trojans surged forward, trying to claim his body as a trophy. But Ajax and Odysseus, two of the greatest Greek heroes, fought desperately to protect Achilles' corpse. Ajax, that mountain of a man, stood over the body like a wall, his great shield turning aside every attack. Odysseus fought beside him, and together they held off the entire Trojan army long enough to carry Achilles back to the Greek camp. In another version of the story, found in later sources, Achilles fell in love with Polyxena, another daughter of King Priam. He wanted to marry her, to finally have peace after so much war. He went to the temple of Apollo Thymbraios to arrange the marriage. But it was a trap. Paris, hiding in the temple with Apollo's "Help!" shot Achilles while he was unarmed and unsuspecting. In this telling, the great warrior died not in glorious battle, but in treachery, killed while seeking love. However it happened, Achilles was dead. The prophecy his mother had spoken at his birth had come true. He had chosen glory over long life, and he had achieved that glory. His name would never be forgotten, but the cost was his life, cut short in the prime of his youth, just as Thetis had always known it would be. The Greeks mourned Achilles for 17 days and nights, a period of lamentation that exceeded even what they had done for other fallen heroes. Not just the mortals mourned him, the immortals grieved as well. The Nereids, Thetis and her 49 sisters, came from the depths of the sea, rising from waves that suddenly went still and quiet. They surrounded their sister as she keened for her son, their voices joining hers in a wailing that seemed to come from the ocean itself. The sound was both beautiful and terrible, a dirge that would be remembered by all who heard it. The Muses themselves, those 9 daughters of Zeus, who inspired all art and poetry, came down from their sacred mountain and sang laments. Their voices, which usually brought joy and inspiration, now carried only sorrow. They sang of Achilles' deeds, of his strength and his courage, but also of his humanity, his capacity for love and friendship, the terrible price he paid for his choice of glory over long life. The entire Greek army participated in the mourning rituals. Every man cut his hair, shearing off locks that fell to the ground like leaves in autumn. This was the traditional sign of grief, a visible marker of loss. Warriors who had fought beside Achilles, who had seen his prowess on the battlefield and his gentleness in camp, wept openly without shame. In a culture that prized masculine strength and stoicism, these hardened soldiers let their tears flow freely, because some griefs are too great to be contained. They prepared his body with all the honors due to the greatest of heroes, following ancient customs that had been passed down through generations. They washed him carefully in warm water, cleaning away the blood and dust of his final battle. They anointed him with oil, precious oils imported from distant lands, massaging it into his skin until he gleamed. They dressed him in the finest clothes, garments fit for a king, and laid him out on a bier where all could come to pay their respects. They built an enormous funeral pyre, not a simple stack of wood, but an elaborate structure that took days to construct. At its base, they laid logs of the finest timber, wood that had been selected for how cleanly it would burn. They built the pyre higher and higher, creating a monument of wood that could be seen from the walls of Troy itself. This was not just about practicality, it was about honor, about making a statement. The pyre's size and grandeur communicated to everyone, Greek and Trojan, alike just how greatly Achilles was valued. They loaded the pyre with offerings, creating a feast for the dead. The bodies of sacrificed animals were arranged around Achilles' body. Horses, those magnificent creatures that had carried warriors into battle, were killed and placed on the pyre so they could carry Achilles in the afterlife. Dogs, loyal companions who had hunted with him, were sacrificed so they could continue to serve him beyond death. Homer's Iliad describes how 12 Trojan prisoners were also sacrificed at Patroclus' funeral pyre, their throats cut as offerings, a practice that, while it shocks modern sensibilities, spoke to the Greek belief that important events required important sacrifices. Whether this same practice was followed for Achilles is not explicitly stated in the surviving sources, though the Greeks certainly mourned him with all possible honors, holding nothing back in their desire to honor the greatest warrior they had ever known. When everything was ready, they set the pyre ablaze. The flames burned all night, consuming Achilles' body, reducing the greatest warrior who ever lived to ash and bone. Thetis had given them a golden urn, crafted by Hephaestus, and when the fire burned out, they collected Achilles' remains and placed them in this urn. But they did not place his remains alone. Following Patroclus' earlier request, they mixed Achilles' ashes with those of Patroclus. The two friends, who had been inseparable in life, would be inseparable in death as well. Their bones mingled together, impossible to separate, a final unity. The Greeks built a great burial mound over the urn, a tumulus that rose high above the shore, visible from sea and land. This mound, they said, should be expanded even further, made large enough to honor both heroes properly. It became a landmark, a place that would be identified as Achilles' tomb for centuries. Historical sources tell us that Alexander the Great himself visited what was believed to be the tomb of Achilles when he began his conquest of Asia, paying respects to the hero he admired and saw as his inspiration. But the death of Achilles brought one more conflict, one more tragedy born from pride and ambition. Achilles' armor, that magnificent set forged by Hephaestus himself, was awarded as a prize to the greatest hero among the remaining Greeks. Two men claimed it, Odysseus and Ajax. The army was asked to judge between them, and they chose Odysseus. The reasons for this choice remain debated. Perhaps they were swayed by his cleverness and diplomatic skill. Perhaps political alliances played a role. But Ajax, who had stood over Achilles' body on the battlefield, who had fought as fiercely as anyone in the war, was devastated by this rejection. According to the myth, in his shame and rage, Ajax went mad. He slaughtered a flock of sheep in the night, believing in his madness that they were his enemies. When his sanity returned at dawn and he realized what he had done, the humiliation was unbearable. He took the sword that Hector had once given him in exchange for his own belt, fell upon it, and died. The armor of Achilles had claimed another hero. In the Odyssey, Homer tells us what happened to Achilles after death. When Odysseus travels to the Underworld to consult the dead, he encounters many shades of fallen heroes. Among them is Achilles. Odysseus greets him warmly, calling him blessed in life and blessed in death, saying that Achilles must rule over the dead as he once ruled over the living. But Achilles' response is heartbreaking. He says he would rather be a slave, the lowest servant of the poorest man alive, than be king of all the dead. Death is not glorious, he implies. Life, even a hard life, even a humiliating life, is better than the shadowy existence of the underworld. But then Odysseus tells Achilles about his son, Neoptolemus. The boy had come to Troy after his father's death and had fought with great courage and skill, proving himself worthy of his father's name. At this news, Achilles' spirit brightens. His son lives on, his blood continues, his legacy is not ended. He walks away through the fields of asphodel with his head held a bit higher, comforted by the knowledge that his life, though short, had meaning that would echo through his descendants. The story of Achilles has resonated through the ages because it touches something fundamental about the human condition. We all face the same choice he faced, though perhaps in less dramatic terms. Do we play it safe, avoid risk, live quietly and fade into obscurity? Or do we pursue our passions, chase our dreams, risk everything for a chance at something greater? Achilles knew the price of his choice. He knew that glory would cost him his life, and he chose it anyway, not because he was foolish, but because he understood something important. Some things are worth dying for. Some achievements are worth a short life lived brilliantly rather than a long life lived in shadow. The phrase Achilles' heel has entered our language as a metaphor for vulnerability, that one weakness in an otherwise strong person or thing. But there's something deeper there too. Achilles' heel reminds us that everyone, no matter how powerful, has a vulnerability. Everyone can be hurt. Everyone will eventually fall. The question is not whether we are vulnerable, but how we face that vulnerability, what we do with the time we have before our own heel is struck. His rage is famous, mentioned in the very first line of the Iliad, the rage of Achilles that brought countless deaths to the Greeks. It was excessive, destructive, harmful to everyone, including himself. But it was also deeply human. Who hasn't felt overwhelming anger at injustice, at being treated unfairly, at having something precious taken away? Achilles' rage went too far, yes, but it came from a real place, from genuine hurt and humiliation. And his grief for Patroclus shows us another side of the warrior. He was capable of profound love, of loyalty so deep that he was willing to throw away his own life to avenge his friend. In a culture that celebrated martial prowess above almost everything else, Homer made sure we saw Achilles' tears, his vulnerability, his humanity. The Trojan War would continue after Achilles' death. Eventually, Odysseus would come up with the idea of the wooden horse. The Greeks would trick their way into Troy, and the city would burn. The war that Achilles had dominated would end without him. But no one remembered the fall of Troy more than they remembered the deeds of Achilles. His story has been retold countless times. Artists through the ages have painted scenes from his life, his mother dipping him in the Styx, his training under Chiron, his duel with Hector, his death by Paris's arrow. Writers have reimagined his story, from ancient Greece to modern novels and films. Brad Pitt played him in the 2004 movie Troy, bringing a version of his story to a new generation, though that film downplayed the gods and changed significant elements of the myth. But the essential truth of Achilles remains unchanged across all these retellings. He was a man who could have been a god, if only he had been willing to live forever in obscurity. Instead, he chose to be fully human, to burn bright and fast, to leave a mark on the world that time would never erase. He chose glory over safety, passion over prudence, and in doing so, he became immortal in the only way mortals ever can, through memory, through story, through the echoes of his deeds that continue to inspire and challenge us thousands of years after his death. The greatest warrior who ever lived died from an arrow to the heel. The strongest man fell to his weakest point. And somehow, that makes his story more powerful, not less. Because it reminds us that heroism is not about being invincible. It's about standing up and fighting even when you know you're vulnerable, even when you know you will eventually fall. Achilles knew his fate and embraced it. That's what made him a hero. That's why we still tell his story. And that is the tale of Achilles, from his birth in a moment of divine prophecy to his death at the gates of Troy. Born of a goddess and a mortal king, trained by the wisest of centaurs, the greatest warrior the ancient world ever knew, he gave up immortality for glory, long life for undying fame. He loved deeply and grieved deeply. He raged against injustice and found peace in mercy. He was flawed and magnificent, vulnerable and invincible, mortal and eternal. His story reminds us that we all have an Achilles heel, that vulnerability that makes us human. But it also reminds us that vulnerability does not mean weakness. Achilles was vulnerable, yes, but he was also the greatest hero of his age, remembered and celebrated long after those who were safer have been forgotten. So, what do we learn from Achilles? Perhaps this, that a life lived boldly, even if it ends sooner than we'd like, is worth more than a life lived in fear. That love and friendship are worth fighting for. That rage must eventually give way to mercy. That glory is real, but so is the cost. And that in the end, all of us, hero and coward alike, will face our own arrow, will find our own vulnerable spot. The question is not whether we will fall, but whether we will have lived before we did. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the story of Achilles, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of Greek mythology. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more heroes and gods and monsters waiting to be remembered. Thank you for listening, and until next time, good night.